The Waverly Hills Sanatorium loomed on the hilltop like a forgotten relic from another time. Its darkened windows stared down at the city below, as if watching, waiting. The building had a tragic history. Opened in the early 1900s as a tuberculosis hospital, it saw thousands of patients enter, but not all of them left alive. By the time it closed its doors, the sanatorium was already famous for the ghostly tales that clung to its crumbling walls like a shroud. The paranormal investigator Mark Thompson had always been skeptical about ghost stories. He believed most hauntings could be explained away by science, coincidence, or even outright fraud. But as a journalist for the local paper, he knew Waverly Hills' reputation was too big to ignore. So on a chilly October night, he found himself standing at the wrought iron gates, his breath fogging in the cold air. He was not alone. There was a small group of investigators with him, armed with cameras, voice recorders, and other ghost-hunting gadgets. Their guide, a local historian named Greg, began leading the way up the narrow path towards the entrance. As you might know, Greg started, Waverly Hills was built to treat tuberculosis patients during the outbreak in the early 20th century. There was no cure then, and many people died here. Some say over 60,000. The death tunnel, a sloped corridor beneath the building, was used to carry the bodies out to keep up the morale of the living patients. Mark listened with mild interest, though his attention kept drifting to the building itself. It seemed to absorb the moonlight, the shadows pooling in the darkened arches. He tried to shake off the creeping unease as they entered through the main doors. The interior was as unsettling as the exterior. Long, dim corridors stretching in both directions, peeling paint and the lingering scent of decay. They began their investigation on the first floor, setting up their equipment while Greg recounted stories of sightings and unexplained phenomena. He spoke of ghostly nurses who roamed the halls, still tending to patients long dead, and the little girl seen playing in the fourth-floor corridor. As the night deepened, the temperature inside seemed to drop even lower. Mark wandered off from the main group, his flashlight sweeping over the grimy walls and broken tiles. A soft sound drew his attention, like footsteps shuffling just beyond the reach of his light. He called out, "Hello, is someone there?" There was no answer, but the air grew thick with a palpable tension. Mark felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He turned to head back to the group, but something made him glance over his shoulder. For just a second, he thought he saw a figure at the end of the hall. A tall, shadowy shape that vanished as soon as his light touched it. Shaking it off as a trick of the darkness, he rejoined the others on the third floor where the infamous death tunnel began. The group decided to split up, with Mark and Greg descending into the tunnel, while the others stayed behind to monitor their equipment. The tunnel was a steep, narrow passage that stretched for nearly 500 feet, with rusted rails running along the ground. The air inside was damp and smelled of earth and mildew. As they made their way down, Mark's sense of unease grew stronger with each step. "Many say this place is the epicenter of the haunting," Greg said, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Some claim to hear voices, and others have seen full-bodied apparitions of doctors or patients." Before Mark could reply, a sudden rush of cold air swept through the tunnel, so intense that it seemed to pierce right through him. It carried with it a faint whisper, so soft that he couldn't make out any words, but it was enough to make him stop in his tracks. "Did you hear that?" Mark asked, his voice trembling slightly. Greg nodded, a serious expression on his face. "It said that the spirits here are restless. Those who died from the White Plague, tuberculosis, suffered immensely. Some of them don't seem to realize they're dead." Suddenly, the lights on their equipment started flickering wildly. At the same time, a deep, mournful groan reverberated through the tunnel, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps rushing towards them. Mark's flashlight flickered and then went out completely, plunging them into darkness. Mark's heart raced as he fumbled to turn his light back on. When he finally did, he saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. There, standing in the middle of the tunnel, was a figure dressed in a hospital gown, its eyes hollow and lifeless. The figure's mouth opened and a guttural wail echoed through the tunnel. Panicking, Mark stumbled back, nearly losing his footing on the wet floor. but as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure faded away, leaving behind an oppressive silence. Back on the surface, the group regrouped, and Mark recounted his experience. Some of the others had picked up strange voices on their recorders and saw shadowy figures in their footage. Mark, still shaking, reviewed the recordings he'd captured on his own device. When he played back the audio, the sound of his own footsteps was clearly audible, followed by a faint, hoarse voice whispering, "Get out!" Then there was a burst of static, followed by a soft, ghostly laugh. As the final chill ran down his spine, Mark knew one thing for sure. Waverly Hills was no ordinary abandoned building. It was a place where the past refused to die.